The year is 1961. Harlem is not sleeping. It never really sleeps. Not at that hour, not in that season, not with the kind of money and fear and history pressing down on every block between 110th and 155th Street. A man is bleeding on the pavement outside a building that does not officially exist. He has been shot 3 times, once through the left shoulder, once in the lower abdomen, once in the side, where the bullet has done something to his lung that he can already feel with every breath he takes. He knows what those breaths mean. He is a man who has spent his entire adult life around violence. He understands the arithmetic of injury. He does not lie there. He gets up. He goes inside. And what he says in the next 4 minutes will set into motion a sequence of events so precise, so cold, so deliberately executed that police investigators will spend the following weeks questioning whether it was even possible. A man was found dead 6 hours later. There were no witnesses. There were no fingerprints. There was no confession, ever. There was only one object left on the body, a gold ring, and every person in Harlem who recognized that ring understood immediately who had sent the message and why no one would ever be charged. This is the story of the night Bumpy Johnson's most loyal enforcer was shot 3 times outside a Harlem casino. What the man did before he died, and what was waiting on the shooter's chest by the time the sun came up. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what Harlem was in 1961. By that year, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson had been the dominant criminal figure in Harlem for the better part of 2 decades. The name on the street was Bumpy. The name his mother gave him had long since been replaced by the geography of his own skull, a bump above the back of his head that he had carried since childhood and that had, by some strange alchemy of personality, become one of the most recognized silhouettes in New York City. He had survived things that should have killed him. He had survived prison. He had survived wars with the Luciano family, specifically the years when Dutch Schultz's people moved into Harlem's numbers racket, and Bumpy fought them block by block and body by body until a negotiated peace was reached on terms that left Harlem's black operators with more autonomy than they had ever held before. He had survived assassination attempts that were never reported to police because the people who planned them could not afford the questions that a police report would generate. By 1961, Bumpy Johnson was 53 years old. He had a heart condition he ignored when it suited him and acknowledged when he needed to leave a room gracefully. He read Thoreau and Marcus Aurelius and Langston Hughes. He gave money to people in the neighborhood who had none. He was feared in a way that is difficult to describe to anyone who did not witness it firsthand, because it was not a simple fear. It was the fear you feel around something that is operating at a frequency slightly different from everything else around it, a quietness that does not read as calm, a stillness that functions as a warning. He controlled territory. He ran operations. He had people who handled things for him. And within that structure, there was a hierarchy, as clearly understood as anything in any legitimate organization. At the top of that hierarchy, just below Bumpy himself, were the men he trusted absolutely. There were not many of them. One of them was a man named Calvin Reese. Calvin Reese is not a name that appears in newspaper archives. It is not a name that shows up in FBI files released under the Freedom of Information Act, at least not in any way that would tell you much about who he actually was. The people who knew him are mostly gone. What remains is the account, pieced together from the edges of documented history, from the oral record of a neighborhood that kept its own memory separate from the official one. Reese had come to Bumpy's orbit in the early 1950s. He was from Harlem originally, born near 126th Street, and had done a stretch at Rikers that had clarified certain things about his own constitution. He was not a man who was built for the visible work. He was not a man who needed the street to know his name. He was built for something more specific: loyalty, proximity, and the willingness to act when Bumpy needed something acted upon, and could not be anywhere near it himself. In the language of that world, he was an enforcer, But that word understates what he actually was to Bumpy Johnson, which was closer to a fixed point. Every powerful man in that structure needed someone who was simply always there, always steady, always reading the room and reading the street and reading the faces of the people who came through the door. Reese was that. He was in his early 40s by 1961. He had a physical presence that people remembered, broad through the shoulders, a way of standing in a doorway that communicated, without any particular expression, that the doorway was his. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble in the way that gamblers gamble, with feeling, with hope. He did not have a reputation for cruelty, which in that world is a more meaningful distinction than it might seem. Cruel men are unreliable. They act on emotion. Reese acted on instruction, on judgment. He had been at Bumpy's side for almost a decade. That kind of tenure, in that kind of life, means something. It means every test has been taken and passed. It means trust has been built. The only way trust is actually built in that world, which is through time and pressure, and the steady accumulation of moments when a man could have done otherwise, and did not. On a night in the fall of 1961, Calvin Reese was shot 3 times outside a building on 133rd Street, and the last thing he did before he died was walk back through the door and tell Bumpy who had done it. The building on 133rd Street was not a casino in any licensed or legal sense. It was a numbers parlor that had been operating for years under a succession of front operations, a barber shop at one point, a social club for a period, and by 1961, a private card room that enough people knew about and few people discussed openly. The men who ran it paid the people they needed to pay, kept the operation quiet, and made money with a consistency that made it worth protecting. Bumpy was there that evening. This was not unusual. He moved through a circuit of Harlem's establishments, not always at predictable hours, not always with the same accompanying people. He had his patterns, and he had his variations. The men who worked security knew his preferences. They knew where he liked to sit, what he wanted nearby, how much space to maintain. It was a practiced choreography, and Calvin Reese was typically part of it. That night, Reese had stepped outside. The accounts that filter through the oral record do not agree entirely on the reason. One version says he went to receive someone, a delivery of some kind, an errand related to the evening's operation. Another says he was managing a specific piece of business that required a quiet word with a man on the street. A third account simply says he needed air. None of these versions can be confirmed, and none can be ruled out. What is consistent across every account is what happened next. The shots came from across the street or from a recessed doorway nearby, depending on which account you credit. 3 shots, not fired in panic, not fired in a spray. 3 shots placed with the intention of killing a man who knew how to make himself difficult to kill. Calvin Reese did not go down immediately. He absorbed the impact of the first shot and turned. He took the second. He stayed standing. He took the third, and in the moment after the third shot, the shooter, whoever he was, apparently decided the work was done because no 4th shot came. What happened next is the part of this story that was still being talked about decades later. He walked back to the door. 3 gunshot wounds, one of them through the abdomen, one through the shoulder, and one into his side with damage to the lung, and Calvin Reese walked back to the door of the building on 133rd Street and opened it and went inside. The men near the entrance saw him and understood immediately what they were looking at. The reaction in that room, in the way such things are described by people who were told about it, was not chaos. It was the specific quiet that descends when something happens that everyone in the room already knew was a possibility, and no one was ready for anyway. Reese did not ask for help. He did not make noise. He moved through the room toward the man he needed to reach, and the room made space for him, because the room understood without being told that there was something he had come inside to do, and that it needed to happen before anything else. He reached Bumpy Johnson, What he said was brief. The accounts do not reproduce the exact words, and they should not be expected to. What they do agree on is the content, a name, a description of where the shots had come from, a detail about the shooter that identified him specifically, something about his appearance or height, movement, or something he had done in the moment that Reese had registered even as the bullets were entering his body, because that was the kind of man Calvin Reese was. He was paying attention even then. Bumpy Johnson listened. He did not speak immediately. The people who were in that room and who later told the story did not report words from Bumpy in that moment. What they reported was the look, the specific quality of attention he gave to what he was being told, the way his face went somewhere else while the rest of him stayed completely still. Reese was placed on a couch. People tried to manage his wounds. He was alive for some time after, long enough that there was a period when it seemed possible he might survive if someone could get him care. But the lung wound was doing what lung wounds do. He died in that room before any formal help arrived. He had walked back through the door to deliver one piece of information. He had done the last significant thing he would ever do, and Bumpy Johnson had heard it. What Bumpy Johnson did in the hours after Calvin Reese died is not something that can be reconstructed from any documentary record. There is no police report from that night that captures his movements. There is no surveillance. There are no informant files that specify what happened between the moment Reese died and the moment the sun came up over Harlem. What there is instead is the absence, the specific shape of what was not there in the official record, and what the people in that orbit understood by morning. Bumpy left the building at some point during those hours. This much the accounts agree on. He did not leave in a group. He did not leave with an entourage or a visible security arrangement. He left in the manner of a man going somewhere specific, not in the manner of a man in retreat. There is a distinction, and the people who saw him make that departure understood the distinction. What follows in the account is silence. 3 hours of silence. 4, 5. The men around him did not ask questions. This is an important thing to understand about that world, that specific structure at that level. Questions were not asked when they were not invited. The people who needed to know things were told. The people who were not told were expected to wait. Harlem at 4 in the morning has its own texture. The numbers runners are done for the night. The card rooms are winding down or running very quiet. The street musicians who play for tips have gone home. The people who live there but work downtown are beginning to stir in their apartments. There is a window of the night that belongs to no particular activity, a window between the last of the evening economy and the first of the morning. And in that window, the streets have a quality that makes movement in them both more visible and, paradoxically, less noticed. Fewer eyes, and the eyes that are open are not always asking what they see. Somewhere in that window, something was arranged. It was not arranged loudly. It was not arranged in a manner that required many participants. The thing about Bumpy Johnson that his biography makes consistent across its full arc is that the operations he carried out with the most personal investment were also the ones that left the fewest traces, not because he was careless, because he understood that thoroughness and simplicity were the same virtue. He had a name. He had been given that name by a dying man who had used his last conscious minutes to make sure it was delivered. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a body was found. The body was found in a service alley off 131st Street. A man who worked the overnight shift at a building nearby reported it when he came out for a cigarette before his shift ended. He told the police he had not heard anything unusual during the night. There was no evidence of a disturbance in the immediate area. The body was positioned in a manner that police initially noted as unusual, in a way that was deliberate rather than accidental, the way a body looks when someone has arranged it rather than left it where it fell. The man was identified in the subsequent investigation. He was known to police, not as a principal, not as someone with a significant criminal profile, but as a peripheral figure who moved through a specific set of associations. someone who was available for work that required no attachment and no visibility, the kind of man who gets retained for a single job and is otherwise not accounted for in the structure. He had been shot once. The medical examiner placed the time of death in the early morning hours, consistent with the window after Reese died and before the body was discovered. This was documented. This was in the report. What was also in the report, because it could not have been left out, was the object found on the body. A gold ring had been placed on the man's chest, not on his finger, on his chest, between his crossed hands, as if it had been set there by someone who wanted it to be impossible to miss. The ring was not his. He had no ring like that. The detectives who responded to the scene noted it immediately and ran it through channels that they perhaps already suspected would not lead them where they were hoping. The ring was traced, through the inquiries that followed, to Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. This was documented. This went into the file. And the file is where it stayed, because the investigation that followed produced nothing actionable. No witnesses, no forensic evidence, no confession, no corroboration of any narrative sufficient to bring a charge. What the ring did, and this is the part that matters, to understanding why Bumpy Johnson placed it there, was not communicate anything to the police. The ring was not a message to law enforcement. Law enforcement was not the audience. The ring was a message to everyone else. In Harlem in 1961, Bumpy Johnson's personal gold ring was not an obscure object. It was something people knew, the way certain things in certain communities become symbols, not because they are designated symbols, but because the weight of association over time makes them so. People who had been in rooms with him had seen it. People who had heard stories about him had heard the ring mentioned. It was one of those specific details that accretes around a powerful man, the kind of detail that becomes shorthand. Placing it on the chest of the man who had shot Calvin Reese communicated several things simultaneously, and it communicated them not to police or to prosecutors, but to the community of people who operated in the same world Bumpy operated in. First, it communicated that Bumpy knew, not suspected, knew. This was the dying man's final act made visible. Reese had come back through the door and delivered the name, and the name had been used, and the ring was the proof that the name was correct. No one who saw the ring on that chest doubted that the right man had been found. Second, it communicated the scope of what had been violated. Killing Calvin Reese was not just an act of violence against a man. It was an act of aggression against Bumpy Johnson directly, an attempt to remove the person standing closest to him, to tear open the space between Bumpy and the street. The ring communicated that this had been understood as such, and that the response to it had been personal. Third, it established something about what kind of power Bumpy Johnson still held in 1961. By that year, there were people who wanted to believe the old certainties had shifted. There were younger men, newer operations, press, from multiple directions. The events of that night demonstrated that the operational capacity had not diminished, that the reach was still there, that the information networks were still intact, that a man could be identified and found in the early morning hours of a single night, and that the entire thing could be done without noise, without witnesses, and with enough control that a deliberate and specific object could be placed on the body as a signature. This was not impulsiveness. This was precision. And the precision was the message. The police investigation went through its expected motions. Detectives came to places where Bumpy was likely to be found. Bumpy was cooperative in the specific sense that he acknowledged their presence, answered what he was legally required to answer, and provided nothing that moved the inquiry forward. He expressed appropriate sorrow about Calvin Reese. He noted that Reese had been a friend and that his death was a terrible thing. He did not know anything about who had shot him. He had not been present on the street when the shooting occurred. He was not aware of any enemies Reese might have had who were capable of such an act. This was not unusual. This was the operating procedure, and it was executed without improvisation. The ring was another matter. The ring created a specific investigative problem because it was documented evidence of a connection. Bumpy's response to questions about the ring was that the ring had gone missing some time prior and that he had no knowledge of how it came to be where it was found. He could not account for it. He was sorry he could not be more helpful. The detectives who handled this case were not naive. They were working in a city and in a borough and in a specific precinct context that had its own complex relationship with the criminal ecosystem of Harlem. They understood what the ring meant. They understood who had placed it there and why. They also understood what they did not have, which was anything that would survive contact with a courtroom. No witnesses, no timeline that could be established through anything other than circumstantial inference. The case file on the killing of Calvin Reese and the case file on the body found in the alley off 131st Street remained open in the formal sense. In the practical sense, they were finished. The ring was returned to Bumpy Johnson after the investigation concluded. He accepted it without apparent ceremony. The thing that stayed in the memory of the people who told this story across the decades was not Bumpy's response. The response, however precise and cold and deliberate it may have been, was consistent with what people already understood about him. It confirmed, rather than surprised. What stayed was Calvin Reese. 3 bullets in the body, blood on the street, a lung that was filling, a calculation that any person's instincts would perform automatically in that situation, an assessment of survival odds, a recognition that the body was telling him what it was telling him, and the decision to override it. Not to go to the ground, not to call out, not to stop, to get up, walk to the door, go inside, find the man who needed to know, and say the thing that needed to be said. This is a specific kind of loyalty. It is not the loyalty of convenience or advantage, or even of genuine affection, though those things may have been present. It is the loyalty that operates past the point where the body is voting against it, the loyalty that is stronger than the survival instinct, which is the deepest and most animal of all instincts. The people who told this story understood it as an illustration of what that world produced at its most extreme. They did not romanticize it exactly. The oral record is too clear, Ed, for that. But they understood it as a thing that deserved to be remembered, that a man in the last minutes of his life, in pain that would have been catastrophic, did not use those minutes for himself. He used them for the work, for the relationship, for Bumpy, and Bumpy Johnson, in the way he responded, demonstrated that he understood what he had been given. A dying man had made a gift of his last functional minutes. The ring on the chest of the man who had taken those minutes was, among everything else it was, an acknowledgement of that gift, a response in kind, a kept promise that had never been spoken aloud, but had always existed in the structure of what they were to each other. 1961 was not a simple year for Bumpy Johnson. The federal attention on organized crime structures in New York had intensified significantly in the years following the Appalachian Conference of 1957. When a meeting of major crime figures in upstate New York had gone badly wrong and produced a set of documented connections that law enforcement used to begin building larger cases, the pressure on all sides of that world had increased. The FBI's attention under J. Edgar Hoover had found new purpose and new tools. Harlem's criminal economy was not insulated from this pressure. The numbers operation, which had been the primary engine of revenue and the primary structure of power for black criminal organizations in Harlem for decades, was being pressured from multiple directions. State and federal inquiries, competition from Italian families who had never fully withdrawn from the territory. The internal pressures that come when any long-running operation has to adapt to external conditions it did not anticipate. Bumpy was navigating this. He had been navigating something his entire life. The specific form of the navigation changed. The internal politics changed. The external pressure has changed. But the fundamental skill of identifying the real situation underneath the stated one and responding to the real situation remained consistent. The shooting of Calvin Reese and what followed has to be understood in this context. It was not an isolated event in a stable environment. It was one incident in a period of sustained pressure and adjustment. What made it significant was not just what it was in itself, but what it demonstrated about Bumpy's capacity to respond at that level, even when everything around him was more complicated than it had been. The shooter, whoever ultimately retained him and directed him and paid him, had made a calculation. The calculation was that removing Reese would create a gap in Bumpy's operational structure that could be exploited, that it would send a signal that the protection around Bumpy was penetrable, that it would do the work that direct confrontation with Bumpy himself was too dangerous to attempt. The response to that calculation was unambiguous. The gap was not exploited. The signal sent was the opposite of the one intended, and the ring sitting on that chest at first light communicated in a language that required no translation that the calculation had been wrong. There is a form of knowledge that operates in communities without ever passing through official channels. It does not appear in records. It is not transmitted in any form that can be subpoenaed or produced in court. It moves through the informal networks that parallel the documented ones, through the people who cook food and cut hair, and deliver numbers and play chess in the parks, and sit on stoops in the evening and notice everything. By the day after the body was found on 131st Street, this knowledge had moved through Harlem in its characteristic way. The knowledge was not uniform. Different people knew different pieces. Some people knew about Reese. Some people knew about the body in the alley. Fewer people knew about the ring, but those who did know about the ring understood that it connected the two events in a way that was not accidental. What the neighborhood processed from this information was a confirmation of something that had been periodically questioned over the previous few years. The question had been whether Bumpy Johnson, aging, dealing with health issues, dealing with increased legal pressure, dealing with the changing landscape of New York's criminal economics, was still what he had been, whether the power was real or residual, whether the name still carried the weight, or whether the name was running on accumulated interest from an account that was being drawn down. The answer came back clear. People who had been considering certain moves reconsidered them. People who had been testing the edges of arrangements they had with Bumpy's operation pulled back, not because they were told to, not because anyone made any explicit communication to them, because they looked at what had happened, at the speed and the precision and the signature left behind, and they drew the obvious conclusion. This is how power actually operates in that world. Not primarily through explicit threat, through demonstration, through the evidence of capacity, through the accumulation of moments that are interpreted correctly by the people who need to interpret them. The night of the casino shooting was one of those moments. It would be cited in the years that followed, in the conversations that build the oral history of a community's relationship with its most complicated figures, as one of the demonstrations that explained why Bumpy Johnson remained what he was for, as long as he was it. There is a question embedded in this story that is worth sitting with. Leaving the ring was a risk, not a legal risk, though it was that too. A different kind of risk. The ring was personal. It was a declaration. In a world where deniability was the operating principle, where the whole architecture of power depended on the gap between what was known and what could be proven, placing a personal object on a body was a deviation from the standard approach. It was deliberate. Everything Bumpy Johnson did at that level was deliberate, which means the question is what he was weighing and what he decided the ring was worth. The answer, as best as it can be reconstructed from what the oral record preserves, is this. Calvin Reese had done something that the ring could not match, and nothing else could match either. He had given his last minutes. He had decided, in the clearest possible way, that the relationship with Bumpy and the work and the loyalty were worth more than whatever the survival calculation said. He had communicated something about what he believed Bumpy Johnson to be, had staked his last conscious act on that belief. The ring was Bumpy's response to that, not to the world, not to the investigation, not to the shooter's employer. The ring was Bumpy Johnson telling a dead man that the message had been received. that the work had been done, that the name had been used and the outcome had been what Reese would have expected it to be, that the trust had been honored from both sides. There is a cold humanity to this. It is not sentimental. It operates entirely within the logic of a world that most people outside of it would find difficult to understand on its own terms. But within that logic, within the specific code of that specific life, the ring communicated something real, something about obligation and response and what you owe to a man who gives you everything he has left. Bumpy Johnson put the ring on a dead man's chest, and then he retrieved it when the investigation released it to him. He wore it again after that. The people who saw it on his hand knew what it had done and where it had been. They did not mention it. In that world, you did not mention things like that, but they knew. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. He died in a Harlem restaurant, among people with food on the table. His heart gave out. He was 60 years old. He had been talking to someone when it happened, and he had been present and engaged, and then he was not. The years between 1961 and 1968 were complicated years for him and for Harlem and for the country. The civil rights movement was in full force. Harlem itself was changing in the way that neighborhoods change when the underlying conditions of their residents' lives are in contested transition. Bumpy had a complicated relationship with that moment. As he had a complicated relationship with most things, he was not purely of one world or another. He gave money to political causes he believed in. He was seen in conversations with people who were fighting for things he cared about. He was also a man who had organized and run criminal operations for 30 years, and who had done the things that such operations require. This is not a contradiction that resolves neatly. It does not resolve at all. It sits in the tension that is the honest description of a life lived in the conditions that produced it. Harlem, in the first half of the 20th century, was a place of extraordinary cultural and intellectual life, and simultaneously, a place where the legal economy offered black men almost nothing, where the only real accumulation of power was through the informal economy, and where the people who ran that economy were simultaneously the parasites and the patrons of the community they lived in. Calvin Reese did not live to see 1968. He died on a couch in a building on 133rd Street in the fall of 1961, having done the last thing he had the strength to do. His name did not appear in the newspapers. His story was not written down. It passed through the oral record and through the memory of the people who knew what he had done and what it had cost him and what it had produced. This is how most of the significant things of that world were preserved. Not in archives, not in official records, in the mouths of people who told it to other people, who told it to other people who eventually told someone who was listening for it. On a street in Harlem in 1961, a man was shot 3 times and used what was left of him to deliver a message. The message was received. The response was sent. And a gold ring placed with the deliberateness of a signature on the chest of the man who had caused it all told everyone who needed to know exactly who had sent it and why. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no charges, only the ring. And the understanding that moved through Harlem in the days that followed, from person to person, through the informal channels that carried the real history of the place, that Bumpy Johnson had not diminished, that the reach was intact, that the loyalty had been honored on both sides, that the debt had been paid. This is the story that was not written in any newspaper. It was not entered into any official record in any form that survived. It lived where it always lived, in the memory of a community that kept its own account of what had happened in its streets and in its buildings, and in the lives of the complicated, extraordinary, dangerous people who had shaped it. Calvin Reese walked back through a door to deliver a name. That name produced a response. The response produced a body. The body had a ring on its chest. Harlem knew what it meant. It always did.